It was horrible.
Of course it was horrible. Violence is a very horrible thing. That's what you're learning now. Your body's learning it.
Hi everybody, this is going to be an attempt to do something slightly different now and again through the video with Joe Abercrombie's The Blade Itself. So I've just read it, just finished it, and I've got lots to say about it, but I'm going to occasionally compare it to some other firsts and series in general, because I've only read this one, so I can't compare it with an entire trilogy, but I can compare it to a few firsts. And to be fair, some of the things I'm comparing it to, I've only read the first example anyway. So, Joe Abercrombie, The Blade Itself. I've heard so much about this before I started reading it. And I had it for a while. And I was prompted to get stuck in when Ollie from Criminally decided it was his turn to read it, sort of thing, his time to read it. And I said, oh, I'll read it as well at this point, you know. And I finished it, but he DNF'd it. But I finished it. And around the point that he gave up on it, I think I was nowhere near at the place where I was at the end. So I felt a little bit similar to how he felt where he was, although I could see that I thought it was well written, but I wasn't really connecting yet. But not long after that point, I did start connecting, and I did get a lot out of it. So I'm going to talk about that, talk about why, but it could seem like the same sort of video that you've seen loads of times from other people. So I'm going to try and talk about a few other series as well and make some comparisons about the tone of it and how it works as a first part of a series. So two kind of things really, what it's like in itself, but also what it's like as an introduction to a series, because I'd say that's the one big fault of it. So, Joe Abercrombie, The Blade Itself. Nowadays, you often hear that this is like the best version of grimdark. And I haven't read the Game of Thrones books. I've got them, but I haven't read them yet. I've seen the series, obviously. The series is amazing. But I haven't read the books yet. I would like to at some point. But it's really just, grimdark seems to be dominated by his books and the Game of Thrones books. And I think it's kind of like spearheading a movement of lots of other fantasy writers writing like that. And it tends to be anti-heroes that you kind of hate to love kind of thing. Lots of violence, kind of gritty dialogue, swearing, unpredictable plots, and unpredictable characters. I think that's what I seem to get from the definition of grimdark. And you do get that in this, definitely. It's definitely lots of swearing, definitely lots of violence. Although not as violent as I thought it was going to be. So that's an interesting surprise. I thought it was going to be a lot more violent. But when the violence hits, it is very brutal. And definitely unpredictable characters. Although saying that, again, not quite as much as I thought. So I think he's very good at painting a very realistic version of an anti-hero. So they're very consistent, but clearly your HBO type characters, the kind of characters that you wouldn't necessarily get in a more romantic fantasy book, which I will mention in a minute. So yeah, unpredictable characters, lots of swearing, lots of violence, unpredictable plots. There isn't actually much of a plot in this. So again, that's definitely a criticism you can make of this, that where the quality of the book lies in the characterization and the dialogue, which is superb, the plotting is a little bit odd in some ways, because the plotting is designed to create the characters really, but I think a lot of authors could probably do both. But with this one, he decided to just start creating a plot right at the end that's basically giving you a chance to get into this, the second book. So, spoiler alert, I now have the other two books because this was so good. So I do want to read the rest of them. I do want to finish the trilogy. I mean, apparently it does get better anyway, but even if it didn't get better, I really enjoyed it by the end of it, and I do want to know what happens next, and I want to know what happens with a few of the characters. So, you know, it was sold to me by the end of it, but the end of it is definitely setting up the next book. So I'm not really sure that that's how you have to play it when you're writing a trilogy. Do you have to set up the next book like that, or can you have a complete story that then expands into the second book plot? I did on my Goodreads review. I said if I was just going to criticise and literally write it off for doing that, then I wouldn't really be a fan of Fellowship of the Ring, which basically does that as well. That's a long story in 3 parts, and clearly this is a long story in 3 parts. It's not one book designed to be a complete book and then a couple of follow-up books. This is one part of a longer story, which is fair enough. But even though that's the case, I would say there's a few examples of where is it a few examples? There's 3 examples I'm going to give now where the first books managed to be complete, and because of that I like them more. But the contents of this definitely sold me the trilogy in the first book, so it's not like I'm going to read the next book hoping that it'll get better, because I did enjoy it. But that's one big criticism I've got. They didn't have to, just put some plot in at the end, just in the last sort of 30 pages. But having said that, the way that he created the characters and the plot devices he put in there and the dynamics between the characters is fantastic. And the characters are very real, and the way they interact with each other is quite complex and interesting, and kind of there's lots of internal dialogue that is giving you more insights into how they're feeling, and there's lots of ways that one character might talk to someone in one way and they might talk to someone else in a different way, and that kind of thing. The actual structure of the book is from different points of view. So there are 3 main characters. You've got Logan Ninefingers, who's the first one that's introduced, and he's a barbarian with a history of being very famous as a barbarian, who's older. He's a bit more jaded, and he becomes part of the melee of characters that kind of interact by the end of it. And you've got Inquisitor Glockter, who again had a very well-known and successful history, but is now crippled and bitter, and he has got a very big part of the plot. All these characters meet up by the end of it. I don't think that's a spoiler, because there's not a plot to say why they meet up, but they do meet up. So there's Inquisitor Glockter, who's now a torturer and somebody who works for the Inquisition. So they're and his job is to root out betrayals and traitors to the government. And the third main character is Giselle Dan Luther, who is a knight, or kind of a knight character. I don't know if they call him a knight in the book. Is he a knight in the book? He's a swordsman and someone who's definitely working for the government, and he's seen as a bit of a sort of he's the closest thing to a kind of a heroic kind of character, although clearly all of them are anti-heroes. He's got his flaws as well, and he's got a bit of a romantic thread in the plot as well. But those are the 3 main characters, and the way the book is written, even though it's not in first person, the book does go between those 3 points of view. So it's not literally points of view as in first person, but it's from their direction, if you like, the plot from their direction and what's happening to them, and it kind of flips between them through the book. So it's quite a good device to do that. Works really well, and clearly a lot easier to follow if it is in third person, because if it's in first person they did that, it might throw people now and again. But one of the clever things about the way it's written is that the characters do have a different way of talking, because they're different people, and their whole attitude, the way the action's driven and the dialogue is driven, is different for each character. So that's really good. And some of the other characters I think were even more interesting. So my favourite character in the whole thing was, don't know how to say it, but Baez. I think his name's Baez. I'm going to say Baez. If it's Baez or something like that, then I apologise. But I'm going to say Baez. He's the Magi, so like the kind of wizard, if you like. But he's not a stereotypical wizard. He's a wizard that fits into this world, and he keeps shocking everybody. Don't really know where he's coming from. Don't really know what he's going to do next. And I like that. And his dialogue's really good and sort of bristly and fresh and sarcastic, kind of jokingly confrontational. So Baez's stuff is really cool. I think his scenes are my favourite scenes. But the romantic thread I thought was really good, really handled really well. And Giselle's character is quite endearing by the end of it. A lot of the characters that other people have said that they grew to love at the moment are fine with me, but not necessarily my favourite characters. It might be like in later books maybe that, for example, Glockter, Inquisitor McGlockter, maybe he gets really endearing by the end of it. I don't know, but it's fine. I wasn't bored by his character or anything, but definitely for me, Baez was my favourite character. There was an interesting character with a really awesome sort of set piece scene by the end of it, who was kind of introduced in a really weird way, was kind of left alone for ages, and then suddenly had this big scene at the end, and that's a female character called Pharaoh. And I thought she was really interesting. I think she does do more in the later books, from what I gather from an interview I saw with Joe Abercrombie. It looked like he kind of talked about her quite quickly, and it seemed like she was quite a big character, but she's not a big character in this. But I thought she was a good character. But there was a couple of times when people were introduced in a really kind of superficial way, and then they didn't really do a lot, and then they did something right at the end, or even didn't really do a lot at the end. So Logan Ninefinger's old friends, his old troupe, they're in there in the background, but absolutely in the background for the whole thing. And it seemed a bit odd, like he knew he was going to use them later, so he thought he'd bring them in now so that it's not a surprise later. But it was so superficial. I'm not really sure he didn't need to do that. But yeah, great dialogue, great characters, a plot that didn't really happen, but clearly it's because it's the first book of the trilogy. That's the thing he was going for. And the reputation about how violent it is and how dark it is probably true, but I might be desensitized to it because it didn't feel as unpredictable or nasty or dark as I was expecting. But it's definitely violent, and there's a few scenes in it that are definitely part of that reputation. But yeah, I did really enjoy it. But let's talk about so I'm going to be reading these two books, the other two books in the series, and I'm looking forward to those. But do you have to just have this sort of to be continued thing in your first book? Well, I don't know if you saw in the video, but I recently finished this. So this was in February, I think it was, that I read this, and I absolutely loved it. It's the first Brandon Sanderson book I'd read, and I really loved it. I thought his writing was brilliant. Very different from Joe Abercrombie's writing, but I tell you what, I'll talk about the magic and the action and the pacing in a minute. But yeah, very different, but much more endearing characters, I think. I couldn't wait to get back in their skin again, and I couldn't put it down. Whereas that one, I could put it down. I read this in about 3 days, and I read that in about 9 days. So that one wasn't pulling me in as much, but this kept pulling me back because I wanted to know what happened next and wanted to listen to them talk and see what was happening with them. So this was definitely more endearing, and it's got an ending. So these are the other two books. I've got the other two books now. So these are the other two books in the Mistborn trilogy. I can't wait to read them. And it kind of reminded me of how much I like this. But even though there's two other books, this has a really nice ending that, if I didn't read anything else, this still would have worked. I think that's a good way of doing trilogies. But again, as I said before, I'm not going to slag off the Lord of the Rings because that's clearly been split into 3 books. The difference with Lord of the Rings was originally it was one book, and it was more for economic reasons because of the time that it was put into 3 books. So it's slightly different because these are obviously intentionally published like that. But yeah, this book has a really great ending, but it is funnier, it's more endearing, the plot's better, and it's just, I think it's just written that slightly better way. Nothing against the general quality of the writing of Joe Abercrombie. He's a really good writer. So that's what I was thinking there with the way of finishing the first book in a trilogy. Going back to this for a second, the magic in this is very different to the magic in Mistborn. So the Mistborn magic is very deliberate. It's got a system. There's certain things you can do and you can't do. There's definitely rules, and it's all built around different metals. And that's part of the charm of the book, but it's also part of the mythos of it and why people love it. But also, clearly, it was a big point in what he was trying to write. He was trying to write a very distinctive magic system. The magic in this is much more like Gandalf and other mage characters where it's just really powerful and do stuff. But I think I get the impression it's also deliberately mysterious, and I think probably in these 2 books, Baez is going to do other things that's going to kind of reveal other things about what he can do, what he can't do, and who he is, because it seems like the other characters are going, who is this guy? So I think we're supposed to be doing that as a reader. But I like the fact that it's quite vague. I also like the fact that the Mistborn ones are not vague, but I like the fact that there's more to discover with this, and the Gandalf sort of version of magic works, I think. So I don't really have a problem with that. Pacing wise, there is action in this, clearly, because we've talked a minute ago about violent scenes, but there is some sections of it that you just think, well, there's not a lot happening, and this kind of character development has been happening all along. I don't need another chapter of reinforcing that particular character trait of that particular character. So there's a few times like that's happening, and that's also why the first 50, 70 pages are a little bit, you've got to get through that to get into some sort of movement. So the pacing's not perfect, but he's very good at writing fight scenes, and there is enough of good pace for you to keep going, I think. The pacing in the Mistborn series is really good, and you can't... there's no sense of wasted pages. So it's a big book, but it feels like it's all worthwhile, and it's all built around creating this story, not necessarily creating the world. So I think in both cases the world building is happening through the whole trilogy. Yeah, so if you compare that to Lord of the Rings, obviously Tolkien spent a lot of time building the world, and there's some moments in the text where it's just language, or it's just descriptions of where things were on the land and things like that. So Tolkien clearly wanted to make a big point about the world building, where they do it while they're storytelling, which I think is better. So jumping into a different story, because this is a recent one again, and it's also one I loved. So I have done a review of Kings of the Wild, Nicholas Eames. I enjoyed this more. I think I enjoyed it more than both of the books I've talked about. And again, it didn't need to be part of a series, but there is now a second one, Bloody Rose, which is a sequel to this. It kind of follows on kind of into the next generation of these guys. And again, it's the characters I thought were well created. I thought the plot was very clear, and it's very plot driven as well. It's a kind of like a rescue plot, but it's really clear what it is from the beginning. It builds up really nicely, and it's not about forgiving it for a bad plot or anything like that. There's lots of ways that this book ticks lots of boxes. So I think part of the way that people might prefer the other books might be that this is not epic in scale. There's no sense of a bigger world, really. It's quite smaller. It's contained in a smaller geographical area, and it could be that it felt too light maybe for some people, but I don't think it's that light. But I love this, and I think the story finishes really well. The characters are really good. It's really funny. I couldn't stop reading it. I read this even quicker than I read Final Empire. So yeah, there's a good example of how a first book, now we know it's the first book because of this, a first book can be a complete story and be really endearing, really funny, great characters, and a very definite story as well, which I don't think you get with the Blade itself. So, just because it seems odd not to talk about it, because I've talked about Tolkien, so the Belgariad, which I'm going to reread soon. The Pawn of Prophecy was the first book. I don't know if you guys know about the Belgariad, but it's definitely got that Tolkien tradition. It's got lots of Tolkien-esque characters and races, and it's got a prophecy that the main character kind of falls into, doesn't realise he's so important, and there's this sort of wise old wizard that tells him how important he is, all that kind of stuff. So it's got lots of tropes that you'll probably recognise, and clearly the series builds up as the books continue, and the world's built larger, partly because the main character discovers this wider world as the story goes on, and you do follow this long story through 5 books. So this is an example, like the Blade itself, where it's not a complete story by the end of this first book, and it's deliberately spanning the whole story over 5 books. Another big difference with this as well is it's very light and fluffy. So this is not grimdark. This is not violent. I mean, it is violent, but it's violence that a teenager can happily read. There's not any swearing in it. There's a lot of innocence in it, and I think it's a great way to start fantasy reading. To be honest, this was one of the first books I read when I was a teenager. So definitely one of the first series I read, and it's better than the Shannara series, I think. And I think it's more readable than Lord of the Rings, even though clearly Lord of the Rings is much more important and much more successful in lots of ways. This is much more readable. So if you I wouldn't suggest you read Lord of the Rings as your first fantasy book, whereas this could be something you could read first to get yourself into fantasy and figure out if you like that sort of thing. But it is light and fluffy, and but you'll love the characters. So all of these examples, I think all of them have got great characters. Yeah. And this isn't fantasy, but it's relevant to what I'm saying. Leviathan Wakes is another example of a long series of books where the first one finishes with a complete ending to the story. And I think that's really good. Again, I love this book. I thought it was fantastic. And I need to read the others. I've got the next 3. I've got the first 4 books. I've got the next 3. So I can't wait to get stuck in. But again, if I didn't, I still would have enjoyed this one, which is awesome because great characters, great dialogue. Again, slightly darker than your average sci-fi thing, maybe certainly darker than Pawn of Prophecy. I really like this. I mean, the characterization is so cool. The dialogue's really good, and some of it's funny, but you just really want to know what was going to happen next. And quite epic in scale already, actually, even with the first book. So yeah, a good example where the ending was an actual ending, even though it continues on to other parts of the series. Which brings me on to my last point, and that is that I'm building up for another Stephen King video. And for this next one, I'm going to read this, The Gunslinger. So I've avoided the Dark Tower series because it's huge. But I figured, well, let's read the first one. As you're doing another Stephen King video, read the first one, and you can say what you think of the first one. But I've got a feeling it's going to be one of those things where it's not going to mean a lot without reading the rest of it. I don't know. If you've read The Gunslinger and you've read the whole of the Dark Tower series, let me know if that's true. I'll still read it, but I will be disappointed because I do think there's an art to carrying on a series while still making each book its own thing. I don't think it's necessary, but I think it's better. So yeah. Tell me what you think of The Gunslinger. But in the meantime, The Blade itself was really good, but it might take you, first 50 chapters, get through that bit, and then you might start building a sense of why you're reading it, and what you're getting out of it, and you'll probably like some of the characters by the end of it, and you'll want to know what happens next, probably, and you might do what I did and make sure you got the next 2 books. So tell me what you think. Thanks a lot. Bye.
future.